York, this is Democracy Now!
We now see the list of impeachable offenses growing by the day, really. Obstruction of justice, conspiring with a foreign government to violate federal campaign finance laws, giving aid and comfort to white supremacists and neo-Nazis, abuse of the pardon power, misusing the law enforcement agencies to attack political opponents, undermining freedom of the press.
White House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says it's just not worth it to begin impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump. Many Democratic lawmakers disagree. We'll speak to John Boniface of Free Speech for People. Then we look at restorative justice with Danielle Serret, author of Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair.
Mass incarceration in America unless we take on the question of violence, because more than half of people incarcerated in this country are incarcerated for crimes of violence. But what's also true is we will never end violence unless we take on mass incarceration, because mass incarceration not only fails to produce safety, it produces more harm.
But first, we look at the political crisis in Venezuela as the U.S. pulls its embassy staff from Caracas. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the diplomats had become a constraint on U.S. policy. Does that mean military intervention? We'll speak to Mark Weisbrod of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's ordered U.S. airlines to ground all Boeing 737 MAX 8 and 9 passenger jets in the wake of a devastating plane crash in Ethiopia Sunday that killed 157 people, all the people on board. Trump's move came as his administration came under mounting pressure to remove the planes from service after safety inspectors said a software glitch was likely behind Sunday's crash, as well as the crash of a Lion Air flight of the same plane type last October in Indonesia that killed all 189 people. Trump's move came hours after Canada became one of the last countries in the world to ground the Boeing jets.
Boeing is an incredible company. They are working very, very hard right now. And hopefully they'll very quickly come up with the answer. But until they do, the planes are grounded.
As Trump continued to praise the Boeing CEO, whom he spoke to several times, Trump's order came as the Federal Aviation Administration spent days resisting calls to ground the 737 MAX jets. The FAA hasn't had a permanent top official for over a year, and Trump's government shutdown stalled the approval of safety upgrades, including new software that might have prevented Sunday's crash. The United States Senate approved a war powers resolution Wednesday that would end U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which has killed tens of thousands of children and brought half of Yemen's 28 million people to the brink of starvation. 7 Republicans crossed the aisle to join the Democratic caucus in Wednesday's 54-46 vote on the measure, which requires President Trump to cut off military support for the war in Yemen unless U.S. troops are directly involved in fighting al-Qaeda. This is Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders, who co-sponsored the resolution with Republican Utah Senator Mike Lee.
Today is an extremely important day. Today, we in the Senate have the opportunity to take a major step forward in ending the horrific war in Yemen and alleviating the terrible, terrible suffering being experienced by the people in one of the poorest countries on earth. And today, equally important, we can finally begin the process of reasserting Congress's responsibility over war making.
The Senate passed a similar war powers resolution on Yemen late last year, but it died after then Republican Speaker of the House Paul Ryan refused to bring it to a vote. The new Democratic-controlled House is expected to approve the measure, though the White House has signaled President Trump will veto it. The son of the Harvard-trained doctor and dual Saudi U.S. citizen is set to appear with lawmakers today to speak out about the torture he says his father is enduring at the hands of Saudi Arabia. Waleed Fatahi is a Harvard-trained doctor and hospital owner who's been detained by Saudi police since late 2017. His son, Ahmed Fatahi, says his father has suffered whippings and electric shocks in prison after he was swept up along with 200 other prominent Saudis in a mass arrest ordered by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This comes a day after the State Department issued its annual human rights report criticizing Saudi Arabia for the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, while defending continuing U.S. support for the kingdom. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, quote, "The Trump administration's policy is to engage with other governments regardless of their human rights record if doing so will advance U.S. interests," unquote. The Senate's poised to pass a bill today blocking President Trump's declaration of a national emergency, which would divert billions of dollars of federal funds to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. At least 5 Republican senators are expected to defect and join Democrats on the resolution. Senators Tom Tillis of North Carolina, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mike Lee of Utah, and Kentucky's Rand Paul. House lawmakers passed a similar measure late last month. President Trump has vowed to veto the bill, and Congress is far from the 2/3 majority needed to override a presidential veto. Trump's declaration faces a number of legal challenges and could ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court. A federal judge in Washington, D.C. sentenced President Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, Wednesday to an additional 43 months in prison on criminal conspiracy charges. The new sentence means Manafort will serve 7.5-year prison term after he was sentenced last week by a federal judge in Virginia on 8 counts of bank fraud and tax evasion. Moments after Manafort received his sentence, Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance Jr. unsealed an indictment charging Manafort with 16 counts of residential mortgage fraud and conspiracy. President Trump hasn't ruled out a pardon for his former campaign chair, but Trump will not have the power to pardon Manafort on the New York charges if Manafort's convicted. In climate news, a new United Nations report warns unless nations act urgently and immediately on an unprecedented scale, the ecological foundations of society are at risk of collapse. The report by UN Environment found that even if the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement are met, winter temperatures in the Arctic will rise between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius, or as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. UN Environment says nations should immediately shift away from fossil fuels to renewable energy while reducing waste and promoting diets less heavy in meat and dairy. In Spain, police investigators have linked an attack on North Korea's embassy in Madrid last month to the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. On February 22nd, 10 assailants carrying fake weapons reportedly broke into North Korea's embassy, seizing computers and cell phones, tying up diplomatic workers, and placing bags over their heads before beating and interrogating them. After a North Korean embassy worker climbed through a second-story window and called for help, the assailants fled at high speed in a pair of stolen vehicles. The Spanish newspaper El País reports at least 2 of the 10 assailants have been identified as having ties to the CIA. The CIA's denied any involvement. The raid on the embassy came just days before President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met in Vietnam for a second summit on denuclearization. North Korea's former ambassador to Spain, Kim Hyok-chol, now serves as a key North Korean envoy in nuclear talks with the United States. In Brazil, 2 gunmen went on a shooting rampage Wednesday at a high school in the outskirts of Sao Paulo, killing 8 people before turning their guns on themselves. At least 17 others were injured by gunfire during the assault, which saw panicked students climbing over the school's walls, screaming to neighbors for help.
They just came out shooting. They didn't look at anyone. They just started shooting at anyone who was close by.
A police investigator said the 2 attackers, aged 17 and 25, were former students at the high school who were inspired by the 1999 Columbine massacre in Littleton, Colorado. In January, Brazil's newly inaugurated far-right President Jair Bolsonaro signed a decree making it easier for people to keep guns at home. In Lagos, Nigeria, at least 10 people are dead and dozens more trapped under rubble after a 4-story building containing a school collapsed Wednesday. Rescue workers continued to search for survivors after some 40 students were pulled from the wreckage. Residents had long reported cracks in the building, which was listed for demolition with the Lagos Building Control Agency. In Britain, lawmakers rejected a resolution Wednesday that would see the United Kingdom exit the European Union without a formal agreement, a so-called no-deal Brexit, setting up a vote Thursday that could see Parliament Parliament asked the EU for an extension of Brexit's March 29th deadline. Joining opposition parties in Wednesday's vote were members of Prime Minister Theresa May's own Conservative Party, adding to speculation that May could soon face another no-confidence vote. Parliament's repeated failures to approve a Brexit plan have fueled calls for a new second referendum on Brexit. Back in the United States, the Senate has confirmed 2 more of President Trump's nominees to the federal bench. Naomi Rao will replace Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. She's a former law professor and clerk for Justice Clarence Thomas, who's backed by the arch-conservative Federalist Society. Also confirmed this week is Paul Matty, who previously served as legal counsel to ex-New Jersey Republican Governor Chris Christie. He'll serve on the U.S. Third Circuit Court in Philadelphia. Their confirmations mean 1 out of every 5 appeals court judges have been nominated by President Trump. The American Civil Liberties Unions obtained documents showing how Immigration and Customs Enforcement has gained access to a vast surveillance database of billions of records on vehicle locations and is using the data to track down undocumented immigrants. The data gathers license plate numbers from red light and speed limit cameras, toll booths, parking lot surveillance cameras, and other sources in order to track drivers with little or no federal oversight. Democratic Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon has called the program a, quote, massive for-profit location tracking database and about the worst I have ever heard of when it comes to Americans' privacy and security, he said. The federal prosecutors have launched a criminal probe into whether Facebook illegally shared the personal data of hundreds of millions of people with some of the world's largest technology companies. The New York Times reports a grand jury in New York has subpoenaed information from at least 2 prominent makers of smartphones and other devices related to the alleged privacy breach. This comes as Facebook already faces a number of ongoing federal investigations, including a criminal probe into how Facebook gave personal data from some 87 million users to the firm Cambridge Analytica without their knowledge or consent, data the company used to sway voters to support President Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign. California Governor Gavin Newsom has signed an executive order putting a moratorium on plans to execute more than 700 prisoners on death row in California. This is Governor Newsom speaking in Sacramento Wednesday.
To line people up to be executed, premeditated, state-sponsored executions, 1 a week for over 14 years. That's a choice we can make, or we can make, I think, a more enlightened choice to advance justice in a different way. There was a National Academy of Science report that came out that estimates 1 out of every 25 people on death row is innocent. If that's the case, that means if we move forward with executing 737 people in California, we will have executed roughly 30 people that are innocent. I don't know about you. I can't sign my name to that.
The order does not abolish the death penalty in California, but will ban the practice during Newsom's tenure. Former Texas Congressmember Beto O'Rourke announced today he's running for president in 2020, joining a crowded field of candidates for the Democratic nomination. In November, O'Rourke drew national headlines when he nearly defeated Republican incumbent Senator Ted Cruz. Beto O'Rourke is headed to Iowa today. The state is home to the first caucus of the 2020 presidential primary season. Beto O'Rourke has not committed to support 2 major legislative priorities of progressive Democrats, Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. And in New York City, activists rallied outside federal court in Manhattan Wednesday, where a judge is overseeing Puerto Rico's municipal bankruptcy proceedings, the largest such case in U.S. history. The protesters are demanding Judge Laura Taylor Swain cancel Puerto Rico's $72 billion debt. This is activist Nicole Torres-Bruno.
You have people depopulating the island because their pensions are cut nearly or in half. I know civil service people that if they are to retire tomorrow, they'll only receive 42% of their pension. And governmental workers in Puerto Rico are not eligible for Social Security. So where does that leave them? There's more than 300 schools that have been closed in Puerto Rico. This is nothing short of Wall Street abuse and tactical steps towards extermination.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. Venezuelan officials are saying power will largely be restored by today after a week-long blackout across much of the country. The cause of the blackout remains in dispute. The United States blamed it on years of neglect of the Venezuelan energy system, but Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro accused the U.S. military of launching a, quote, cyber attack against the electrical, telecommunication and internet systems. The blackout comes amid a growing political crisis in Venezuela as U.S.-backed opposition groups attempt to topple Maduro's government. It's been nearly 2 months since opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself to be president with the backing of the United States.
On Monday, the United States announced it's withdrawing remaining diplomatic staff from its embassy in Caracas. In a statement, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said diplomatic staff at the embassy has become, quote, a constraint on U.S. policy. Pompeo's comment raised questions about whether the U.S. is coming closer to military intervention in Venezuela. Meanwhile, the U.S. has announced new sanctions on Venezuela despite a growing humanitarian crisis in the country. The U.S. is also intensifying pressure on India and other nations to stop buying Venezuelan oil. We're joined now by Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and president of Just Foreign Policy. His latest piece for the New Republic, The Reality Behind Trump's Coalition for Regime Change in Venezuela. Why don't you talk about that reality, Mark?
Well, there's this narrative from our government and also in the media that this is some kind of clash of civilizations. You have on one side these democratic, so-called democratic governments in Latin America and Europe, and then on the other side they always bring up China or Russia or Turkey, saying, authoritarian governments are supporting the government of Venezuela. But when you look at this, you see that it really is just like the coalition of the willing that George W. Bush had, 48 countries. In this case, there's about 50. In his case, there were 48 countries that supported his invasion of Iraq. And that's really what you have going on here. And in Latin America, it's kind of ironic because you have countries that the United States actually is responsible for putting the government there. So in Honduras, there was a military coup in 2009 that brought the current political party to power. And then in 2017, the president stole the election, and not like, any other election that, you could say is unfair, but in this case, they literally stole it. That was the conclusion of observers across the political spectrum. And even the head of the OAS, who's fanatically attached to the Trump regime change effort in Venezuela, even he said that they needed a new election, but they just, the Trump administration went along with it. But then you have Brazil, the strongest ally that the U.S. has in this whole effort. And as you know, this is a really far-right government that has its own problems of legitimacy with regard to how it got to power through an impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which was not even based on a crime, and then the jailing of the most popular politician in the country who probably could have won the presidency, Lula da Silva, and unconstitutionally preventing him, jailing him before the election and even preventing him from talking to the media. So this is the kind of people you have. You have the, Colombia also, which is a government, the President Ivan Duque, he was basically picked by Alvaro Uribe, who has long ties to death squads and also to narco trafficking. So these, again, you have these governments. This is the coalition of the willing. They are, Argentina just got a $50 billion loan from the IMF. They owe something. They owe a lot. And, of course, they're very close to the Trump administration anyway, ideologically and politically. And then the European governments, of course, they go along with the U.S. on Latin America in general. They haven't had really only occasionally an independent foreign policy from the United States since the end of World War II.
Well, Mark Weisbrot, could you elaborate on what you think the Trump administration wants to happen in Venezuela? They've said explicitly they want Maduro out. But what do they want in his place, and why are they so averse to any kind of a negotiated agreement?
Yeah, that's very important because there has to be a negotiated agreement of some kind. It's a polarized country. You're either going to have a negotiated agreement or you're going to have a civil war, and then you'll have a negotiated agreement. And they're pushing towards some kind of extra-legal and probably violent regime change. And why are they doing this? It's because they want their people in power. It's not enough that to them that you just get a new government or you have an election. They really want their own people. And that's why they picked, if you look who they chose to lead this, Juan Guaido. He's with a party, Voluntad Popular, which has only 14 out of 167 seats in the National Assembly. And there are other leaders who would be more favorable towards negotiation, but they picked him because his party is the most hardline and doesn't want to negotiate, and they've said that publicly. And of course, even after the Pope offered to mediate, and Uruguay and Mexico, who have governments that are neutral, and they offered to negotiate, Guaido, and also the Trump administration said immediately, no, the time for negotiation is over, and they're not interested in it. So again, it's so they can get the actual people that they want. And of course, both Trump and Bolton have made actually public comments about how they want the oil.
On Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused Cuba of being the true imperialist power in Venezuela.
No nation has done more to sustain the death and daily misery of ordinary Venezuelans, including Venezuela's military and their families, than the communists in Havana. Cuba is the true imperialist power in Venezuela. The Cuban government of Miguel Diaz-Canel provides political cover for Maduro and his henchmen so that they may stay in power.
So that's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mark Weisbrot, can you respond to that? And also the U.S. pulling out the last diplomatic representatives from Venezuela. Does this sound like preparation for military intervention? But start with Cuba.
Yeah, well, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, who is strangling the country economically? I think that's the most important thing that people don't understand, and even members of Congress don't understand. For example, recognizing Guaido is actually declaring a trade embargo because it means that the government cannot sell the oil to three-quarters of its export markets and get the foreign exchange that the country needs. And all this talk about they're targeting the government, it's targeting the civilian population. That's what these sanctions do. And not just the sanctions that they just imposed in January, but the sanctions that they've had since August of 2017 that have really destroyed the economy and created shortages of food and medicine, worsened everything, and prevented the government from doing anything that they could do to recover from both the hyperinflation and the depression. And I want to emphasize that because, people say, oh, well, the economy was already a wreck before even these sanctions. But, if somebody has pneumonia and you blockade their house so they can't get medical treatment and they die, and you would be held criminally responsible for that. And it wouldn't be much of a defense to say, well, I think they would have died anyway. And that's basically what you have in the narrative in the media. They almost ignore that, for more than a year and a half, and even before that, because there were sanctions before that. But the worst sanctions, the financial embargo, started in August of 2017. And the media mostly ignores that. And that's what's being used to basically deprive people of food and medicine, to destroy the economy. And so that's the imperial power, using a power that only the United States has because of its control over the dollar-based international financial system. And they're doing that. And whatever the Cubans are doing there is mostly, trying to help them.
And military intervention?
Yeah, the military intervention, I think the Trump administration wants to convince, obviously, everyone that that option is on the table and everything. And I don't think that's their first choice. I think they'd rather have Venezuelans killing each other than have the U.S. Involved in the war itself. But, yeah, if they had the right pretext, I think they would go in.
And, Mark, can you talk about what kind of resistance there's been in Congress to the Trump administration's policies on Venezuela, in particular Florida Democrats?
Yeah, that's another really important thing. And I'm glad you asked that because, there really is a way of stopping this. And it's the grassroots pressure that, for example, you mentioned the Yemen vote in the Senate yesterday, and that was another historic vote where the Congress uses the War Powers Resolution. It's the first time in 45 years that the Senate has been using this to try to demand that legally that the U.S. pull out of its military involvement in this genocidal war. And so there's a similar bill in the House right now from Representative Cicilline, and people are fighting to get that to the floor because the leadership is not in favor of it. And Nancy Pelosi, for example, has to be pressured, and people are pressuring them. There was just a big petition signed by national advocacy groups that went to Pelosi, I think yesterday, that said, we want this to get to the floor of the Congress. It says there will be no U.S. military intervention, military force in Venezuela without congressional authorization. And of course, that's the law. But the Florida delegation doesn't want that. They're pro-regime change, pro-war, and a number of them. And in fact, they have two bills, one from Debbie Wasserman Schultz right now in the Foreign Affairs Committee. They're going to be voted on today. And so what the petition is asking and what the grassroots advocacy groups are demanding is that, we don't want those two bills, which are bills that basically move more towards war and away from a negotiated solution. For example, the Wasserman-Schultz bill says that the Trump administration has to issue a report about Venezuela's ties to Russia and the security threat supposedly posed by that. So this is the kind of stuff you have pushing back from the Florida delegation. And I want to emphasize that, if people either have a House member on the Foreign Affairs Committee or any representative, you have a representative, unlike, we don't have a voting representative in D.C., but anybody in the country, this is the time to tell them you want this bill against military intervention to pass. That's how that bill passed the Senate and the House, and now it's going back to the House on Yemen. It was grassroots pressure. It never would have happened without that. Mark
Weisbrot, we just have 20 seconds. The issue of the power shortage that's just beginning to end in Venezuela, the complete blackout. Maduro has accused Guaido and the United States being behind this blackout.
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing that we do know for sure about it is that the backup generators that could have provided power for a lot of the country, the New York Times reported that they didn't have fuel and other things because of the U.S. sanctions. So they definitely had, the sanctions definitely had an impact in the result of that blackout.
Mark Weisbrot, thanks so much for joining us, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research and president of Just Foreign Policy. We'll link to your piece in the New Republic, The Reality Behind Trump's Coalition for Regime Change in Venezuela. And to see all of our coverage of Venezuela, you can go to democracynow.org. We'll be back on the issue of impeachment in a minute.
Look at all the toys I got. Look at all the things I need. Hey, look at all the toys I got. Look at all the mouths I feed. Well, I got a wonderful deal for you. What belongs to me belongs to you. I understand what you're going through. I know the point to push it through. My policy helps me help you. Generosity helps me help you. Conspiracy helps me help you. Put your trust in me, I'll help you too. Look at all the things I've done. Look at all the rights I've done. The means will justify the end. For you to say and me to stay. I got a great idea, you see. What belongs to me belongs to me. I know just what you want to do. I know how I can get
Helps Me, Helps You by Midnight Oil. And a shout out to today's students from American Sign Language and English High School who are here watching today's broadcast. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Democratic lawmakers are continuing to push for the impeachment of President Donald Trump, despite House Speaker Nancy Pelosi speaking out against impeachment in an interview earlier this week. Impeachment rumors have been swirling since the Democrats regained control of the House in January. But Pelosi told the Washington Post Monday she is not planning on launching impeachment proceedings against Trump, saying, quote, he's just not worth it, and that it was too divisive. She called Trump ethically and intellectually unfit for the presidency, but said Congress would require an overwhelming and bipartisan reason for impeachment. But some Democratic lawmakers have pushed back on Pelosi's comments. Washington Congressmember and Progressive Caucus co-chair Pramila Jayapal said that congressional investigations should determine the appropriate course of action and that evidence of a, quote, consistent pattern of abuse of power or of obstruction of justice would be grounds for impeachment. Congressmember Rashida Tlaib of Michigan said that she would continue with plans to formally introduce articles of impeachment this month. This is Tlaib announcing plans to impeach Trump last week.
If we don't hold impeachment proceedings today, start them today and hold him accountable to following the United States Constitution, think about that. This is not going to be the last CEO that runs for President of the United States. This is not going to be the last person that tries to get away with this. And what does that say about the most powerful, most important most important position in the world?
Detroit Congressmember, that is Congressmember Rashida Tlaib. Democratic Congressmember Al Green of Texas also said he'll bring impeachment proceedings to the House floor regardless of Pelosi's comments.
It's time for people to decide, are we going to take on bigotry or are we going to allow it to fester and grow? You don't eliminate bigotry by dealing with it in a politically expedient way. You have to take it head on.
Well, for more, we're joined by John Boniface, attorney and political activist specializing in constitutional law and voting rights, co-founder and president of Free Speech for People, one of the organizations calling for Trump's impeachment, co-author with Ron Fine and Ben Clements of The Constitution Demands It, the case for the impeachment of Donald Trump. John Boniface, we've had you on a few times in the last 2 years. This latest development of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, saying now is not the time for impeachment. Your response?
Amy, thanks for having me. The president is a direct and serious threat to our republic. He is almost on a daily basis attacking our Constitution, our democracy, and the rule of law, and he has created a constitutional crisis through this conduct. So for Speaker Pelosi to say that we're not going to focus on impeachment in the midst of this constitutional crisis is a real abdication of her responsibility, the oath she took to defend and protect our Constitution as a member of Congress. The framers placed the impeachment power in the Constitution precisely to address this kind of constitutional crisis we face today. And it is not a question of waiting for an election to deal with that crisis. When you have a present threat to the republic, when you have a president who so defies the rule of law and the multiple impeachable offenses he has committed, Congress must address that crisis now through the impeachment process.
List some of those impeachable offenses, the precise grounds on which Trump could be impeached.
Yes, the first impeachable offense was when he took the oath of office without divesting fully from his business interests all across the world, in direct violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause and the Domestic Emoluments Clause, treating the Oval Office as a profit-making enterprise at the public expense. These anti-corruption provisions of the Constitution were designed to ensure that we would not have a president in the Oval Office who would be beholden to foreign interests or play favorites with certain states with business interests in the United States. The second is obstruction of justice. We already have seen the firing of James Comey when he didn't get what he wanted by trying to stop the Russia investigation. That's why we have Robert Mueller as a special counsel investigating this matter. We've seen conspiracy to violate federal campaign finance law with secret hush money payments to influence the 2016 election. Federal prosecutors have already named Donald Trump as individual one, the person who was directing that criminal conspiracy. Abuse of the pardon power by pardoning former Sheriff Joe Arpaio of Maricopa County, Arizona, when he had violated thousands of people's constitutional rights and then was found in criminal contempt of court for refusing to stop, the undermining of the freedom of the press, the cruel and unconstitutional imprisonment of children and their families at the southern border in violation of their due process rights, their equal protection rights, and their rights under the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, the funding and building of a wall by declaring a national emergency at the southern border in violation of the separation of powers principle that makes clear that Congress and only Congress has the power to appropriate monies. And here Congress had explicitly refused to fund this wall. You know, even that last impeachable offense this president has committed on this declaration of a national emergency raises the question, with the president so dangerous in the Oval Office, what more will he declare an emergency on? Shutting down the Internet, arresting protesters he doesn't like, engaging in issuing martial law? I mean, this is the danger we have with someone in the Oval Office who so threatens our republic, and is precisely why the framers placed the impeachment power in the Constitution.
John, President Trump tweeted Wednesday, "I greatly appreciate Nancy Pelosi's statement against impeachment, but everyone must remember the minor fact that I never did anything wrong. The economy and unemployment are the best ever. Military and vets are great, and many other successes. How do you impeach a man who is considered by many to be the president with the most successful first 2 years in history, especially when he's done nothing wrong and impeachment is for high crimes and misdemeanors?" Your response?
Well, this is precisely why members of Congress should get behind Congresswoman Tlaib's resolution she's going to be introducing soon in the U.S. House of Representatives, because it will be the way to start an impeachment investigation. What Congress needs to do is initiate an impeachment inquiry into all the impeachable offenses this president has committed. That's the first step in the impeachment process. And Congresswoman Tlaib is an American heroine for standing up and the courage and leadership she's shown to defend our Constitution and our democracy, as is Congressman Al Green. The responsibility of members of Congress in this moment of crisis is to defend our Constitution and our democracy, and that's what's required here. We do not need traditional congressional oversight. We need impeachment hearings.
Well, John Bonifaz, is there anything to indicate that there would be sufficient support in Congress to bring about impeachment?
I think the grassroots pressure continues to grow all across the country. Millions of people have signed petitions demonstrating they want Congress to act on this, and we will only hear more from people across the country as the evidence grows. But really what's required here is Congress to follow their oaths of office and defend our Constitution. And for people who want to get engaged and demand that their member of Congress stand up, they should join us at impeachmentproject.org and join this overall movement to protect our republic.
And Nancy Pelosi saying you just don't have the numbers. We would not do this unless it was bipartisan. Do you think she has good cause here to be opposed to impeachment at this moment?
I mean, what's happening here, Amy, is that Speaker Pelosi is completely ignoring history. If the bipartisan requirement had been placed in 1973 before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee by the House leadership at that time in investigating whether or not President Richard Nixon should face impeachment, there never would have been any impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon. Less than 30% in polling supported impeachment proceedings against President Nixon at that time, and yet the House Judiciary Committee moved forward and started Judiciary Committee proceedings. Further, there was no evidence whatsoever at that time that 67 senators would vote to convict President Nixon. But as time went on, as impeachment hearings began, as the nation learned about the abuses of power and abuse of the public trust that President Nixon had committed, the public came to understand what was at stake. That's the responsibility of Congress here. If Nancy Pelosi is putting forward a standard that would never have been put forward in 1973, 1974, President Nixon never would have faced the impeachment proceeding. That's not the standard for impeachment. The standard is, are there abuses of power, abuse of the public trust? The House must carry out their responsibility, issue those charges, and send those to the Senate.
John Bonifaz, I want to thank you for being with us. Attorney, political activist specializing in constitutional law and voting rights, co-founder and president of Free Speech for People, one of the organizations calling for Trump's impeachment. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a new book is out, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Stay with us.
Soon it will be the phase of the moon when people tune in. Every girl knows about the punctual blues, but who is to know the power behind our moves? Dear coincidence, the radio and the weather will go away. We know what we're all gonna say. Dear Ives, funny had a feeling he was on his way. Raise our hearts to the strange phenomenon. Some birds on a feather flock together. We raise our hearts to the pandemonium. Sure enough, he has the answer. He has the answer. He has the answer.
Strange Phenomena by Kate Bush. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end today's show with criminal justice reform and the fight to end mass incarceration. Criminal justice reform has gained momentum in recent years, with 2020 Democratic presidential candidates vowing to take on the issue, and a number of states across the country tackling everything from cash bail to sentencing reform. But these efforts have focused almost entirely on nonviolent and drug offenses, while sidestepping a problem at the core of what Michelle Alexander calls America's addiction to incarceration: violence. A staggering 2.2 million people are locked up in America's sprawling prison system, and more than half of those currently confined in state prisons have been convicted of violent crime. In order to cut the prison population in half and transform criminal justice in this country, our next guest argues that reformers must reckon with violent crime and come up with radically new ways to address it. Danielle Sered lays out a path for this transformation in her new, unflinching book titled Until We Reckon. Sered has spent nearly a decade working directly with people who have committed violent acts and survivors of violence as the executive director of Common Justice, a Brooklyn-based organization that offers alternatives to incarceration for people charged with violent felonies. Her experience anchors her book as she calls for a complete overhaul of the way we've been taught to think about crime, punishment, and justice. She also challenges the notion that prisons keep us safe, revealing instead how incarceration perpetuates the very violence it's meant to curb.
Danielle Sered writes in her new book, "If incarceration worked to secure safety, we would be the safest nation in all of human history. We would not be a nation where, by the most conservative estimates available every year, nearly 3,000 young men of color are murdered before their 25th birthday. More than 57,000 children survive sexual violence. Nearly 500,000 women are beaten in their relationships. Nearly 3 million men are robbed or assaulted. Countless transgender people are killed for who they are, where every year we bury our own children gunned down in our own streets." She goes on to write, "Just as we ask people who cause interpersonal violence to reckon with their actions, so should we as a society call on ourselves to reckon too. Until we do so, no different future will be possible." Danielle Sered is the executive director of Common Justice. It's the first program of its kind in the country. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So talk about what we must reckon with.
So there's no path to ending mass incarceration that doesn't include addressing violence. That's partly because, as you said, more than half of people in this country are incarcerated for crimes of violence. But it's also because our national addiction to prison is based in a story about some imagined monstrous other, somebody who is not quite human the way we are, from whom we have to be protected at any cost. It's that image of somebody that has been racialized in this country since our very beginnings that animates us to choose prison over schools, prison over hospitals, prison over basic infrastructure. And until we tackle that central narrative, the possibility of actually ending mass incarceration in our lifetime won't be within reach.
What about that distinction between violent and nonviolent crimes?
So I think honestly, it is the people who have advocated for reform who have made that distinction most central. Many people who experience violence know that their relative who struggles with addiction and their relative who gets in fights at a family barbecue are the same relative. That distinction has been considered politically expedient, and in many ways, for some of the shorter terms wins, it has been. The problem is it sets up a barrier to us doing what has to come next. But the other problem is that if you asked crime survivors what types of crimes it was most important that we get right, they wouldn't say petty theft, and they wouldn't even say drug possession. They would say crimes of violence. And the problem is that prison not only fails to keep them safe, it actually creates more danger.
Well, I want to ask, Danielle, how you came to this position. I mean, you start your book with a very striking couple of sentences, which I'll just read. As a teenager, you write, sleeping on a friend's couch, I woke up one night to the sound of the bullets stopping. There was a time once when I would have awakened to them starting, but that was long before the level of violence in Chicago went through the roof, before the crack epidemic, before mass incarceration. So could you talk about how you came to see the importance of the question of violent crime as against nonviolent crime and incarceration?
Absolutely. So when I grew up in Chicago, I came of age at the same time mass incarceration really began to gain its foothold in this country. And we saw people go away and come home worse for it. I think that's largely because the thing prison targets most squarely is the thing in me that hurts when you suffer. There are people who are incarcerated who are capable of keeping that intact, but the system is designed in every single way to undermine it. So when people came home worse for having been away, we didn't think about it in some abstract notion of recidivism. We experienced it as harm within our own neighborhoods.
Well, worse in what sense, would you say?
I think people had... Trauma hurts people. Isolation hurts people. And so I'm in the business of ending violence. And we know the 4 core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The 4 core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so we have baked into our central response to violence in this country precisely the things that we know generate it. It's reliable in doing so. It's why study after study will find prison has what's called a criminogenic effect, which means it not only fails to reduce recidivism, it increases the likelihood that someone will cause both more and greater harm going forward.
So what is the alternative?
At Common Justice, we offer one of them. And of course, the real answer to displacing mass incarceration will require many. In Common Justice, we bring together people who have committed serious violence with the consent of the people they've harmed into a dialogue process after extensive preparation. In that process, they acknowledge the harm done to the survivor. They reach agreements about what the responsible person can do to make things as right as possible. If the responsible person fulfills those agreements and continues through our violence intervention curriculum for the year following that dialogue, they don't go to prison and the felony charges against them are dismissed. And in the meantime, we work with the survivors of their crimes to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally.
What is a violence intervention program? I mean, what would they go through?
So the core of what they do is mostly consumed by acting on the agreements, the commitments they've made to those they hurt. So that may include restitution, community service, getting work, getting clean, talking to other young people in their neighborhood, any number of things that are deemed of value.
For example, a rapist?
We don't work with sexual violence at Common Justice. Others do. We don't do that because we think these processes are inapplicable to them. We do it because we understand that sexual violence is distinct from the kind of street violence that we address. But the violence intervention program with us, the part of their work that actually happens in our office, requires people to reflect on the values, beliefs, experiences, and expectations that drove their decision to commit harm in the first place. We don't believe that people are just sort of trauma machines who take it in and put it back out. Violence is a choice people make, and given a context in which to actually examine the underlying drivers of that choice, people can choose to behave differently.
Well, can you explain, Danielle, if there are any precedents or examples of the kind of restorative justice that you're advocating?
So restorative justice practices are thousands of years old. They're actually far older than the court systems that we think that they're the innovative intervention to transform. Restorative practices have their roots in Native communities in this country and in other indigenous communities across the world. And so since time immemorial, when communities have dealt with people who belong to them, who are members of their community, who commit acts that they know to be wrong, they look for courses of actions that will not only change that behavior, but will keep that community whole. And so there are programs around the country that apply restorative justice to lower level crimes than those we address, that apply restorative justice with younger people in the juvenile system, even with serious crimes. Common Justice is the first to apply these practices as a diversion from the criminal justice system, but it is anything but new. Compared to restorative justice, the criminal justice system is like a little toddler on its grandmother's lap.
I wanted to read a quote of Michelle Alexander, the scholar, civil rights lawyer, and the author of The New Jim Crow. She wrote in her New York Times column about Michelle Sered's book. She said, "Our criminal injustice system lets people off the hook, as they aren't obligated to answer the victim's questions, listen to them, honor their pain, express genuine remorse, or do what they can to repair the harm they've done. They're not required to take steps to heal themselves or address their own trauma, so they're less likely to harm others in the future. The only thing prison requires is that people stay in their cages and somehow endure the isolation and violence of captivity. Prison deprives everyone concerned, victims and those who have caused harm, as well as impacted families and communities, the opportunity to heal, honor their own humanity, and to break cycles of violence that have destroyed far too many lives." You use examples in your book, Michelle Sered. Those are the words of Michelle Alexander, recommending until we reckon. Danielle Sered. Give us some of the examples.
I think one of the most powerful ones early on is I said earlier that we only take cases into the project if the victims of the crime consent. It's important to remember fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place. Another half don't even make it past grand jury. So that means that the victims who remain in the system following indictment are the ones with the greatest appetite for incarceration. These are the victims we ask whether they want to see the person who hurt them go to prison or come to common justice. Early in our experience, we were talking to a mother whose 14-year-old son had been robbed and beaten. The young man who caused this harm to him was facing at least 3 years in prison. And I was having a conversation with that mother about whether he should go to prison or common justice. And she said to me, when this young man first hurt my child, first I wanted him to burn to death. And then I wanted him to drown to death. And then I realized as a mother, I don't want either of those things. I want him to drown in a river of fire. And she said, but the truth is 3 years from now, my 9-year-old boy will be 12, and he'll be going to and from school, to and from the corner store, to and from his aunt's house alone. And one of those days, he'll walk past this young man. And I have to ask myself on that day, do I want this young man to have been upstate, or do I want him to have been with y'all? She said, now, if he were before me today and I had my machete, not a machete, my machete, I would chop him to bits, bury him under the house, and sleep soundly for the first time since he dared lay hands on my baby. The truth is I'd rather him be with y'all. I think we have a myth that moving towards some different response to crime requires forgiveness, requires mercy, requires compassion, requires victims who embrace the people who hurt them as though they are their own family, as though they could be brothers. That's not what it requires. What it requires is pragmatism. That mother made a decision to prioritize the safety of her children and children like him over her emotions. That may or may not be a mother's obligation. It certainly seems that prioritizing safety over emotion is the job of the criminal justice system.
And what's your own sense of that from your personal experience? You yourself are a survivor of violence.
As a survivor of violence, I know there are very few things that contribute more to our healing than the accountability of those who have hurt us. We want to tell them the impact they had on our lives. We want to ask them questions about what they did and why they did it. We want them to fill in the stories that the trauma itself makes it difficult for us to remember fully. We want them to make it right in a way that we get to help define. And in some ways, most of all, we want them to become someone who won't do that ever again, not to us and not to anyone else. The problem is for every single one of those goals, prison not only doesn't accomplish it, it precludes it. It separates us. It encourages denial rather than admission. It separates people from opportunities to make repair. And if anything, it makes it more likely that it will cause more harm rather than less.
Mm-hmm. Did you find any kind of restorative justice in your own situation? Could you share?
I didn't. And most of us don't. And that's part of one of the greatest harms of mass incarceration is in part that it teaches us that we don't know what to do, that we as people, as communities, have no capacity whatsoever to deal with harm. And so we're often left with a choice between the criminal justice system and nothing. And even those of us who have critiques of the criminal justice system then end up with nothing at all. It's our aspiration not only that common justice and programs like it expand, but also that people who live in community with each other act on what actually is our inherent capacity and expertise as neighbors and family members to make things right when we've broken them.
Like the First Step Act, do they worsen the situation when it comes to dealing with people who've committed violent crimes and perpetuating stereotypes?
So I think every policy reform is going to be incremental until we are actually passing sort of the abolition of prison and full reparations. Anything short of that is an incremental reform. And so I don't think critiquing those laws simply because they don't go far enough is necessarily the right approach. At the same time, when we make laws or when we pass laws that advance reform for nonviolent offenses and mobilize a narrative that distinguishes those people from the true bad ones. That says don't lock them up with the ones who will make them worse somehow by sheer proximity to their evil. When we double down on that narrative, we cause enormous harm. And so policy is the space of compromise. We're naive to think it will be anything other than that. Our narrative, our stories, our arguments for why we make those changes don't have to be.
Do you see any indication at all that the conversation is shifting on violent crime? Nonviolent crime, we see some movement, but on violent crime?
In the public discourse, less so. In the movement to end mass incarceration, I think people have either done the reflective work or run the numbers and understand that there is no pathway to victory without it. But the place where that conversation has always been happening is in communities where violence is prevalent. When I said before we gave victims the choice whether or not to choose common justice, 90% choose common justice. 90%. And it's not mostly because of mercy and compassion. It's because of pragmatism. People who live in neighborhoods where incarceration is common have been paying for its failure since its inception. And so the conversation about its failure to produce safety and the appetite to do something different is long-standing anywhere that people live with what it produces.
And finally, in the last 30 seconds, the larger societal obligation to address the harm?
So in interpersonal harm, we believe that people are required to acknowledge what they've done, acknowledge its impact, express genuine remorse, make things as right as possible in a way defined by those harmed, and become someone who won't do that ever again. As a nation, we have caused extraordinary harm through incarceration to the people we've locked up, to their families, to their community members, and we've weaponized the pain of victims dishonestly to justify that while never tending to their needs.
We're going to ask you to hold that thought, and we're going to continue with part 2 of our discussion. We'll post online at democracynow.org. Danielle Serret is Executive Director of Common Justice and author of the new book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. I'll be speaking in Denver, Colorado on March 15th, Friday night at 7 o'clock at East High School. Check our website at democracynow.org. We have a job opening for a full-time junior systems administrator. Go to the website. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.